Hello, I'm Jim Garrison. I want to continue my reflections on the conflict in Ukraine out of the realization that I think most of us have that the conflict has brought the world to its most dangerous moment in our lifetime because of the increasing possibility that either the United States or Russia will use nuclear weapons. We haven't been in this moment since 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis, when thankfully President Kennedy and General Secretary Khrushchev had the wisdom to understand that they needed to stand down. The Soviets withdrew their missiles from Cuba, and the United States withdrew its missiles from Turkey. I want to start by making a bold statement. If you continue to believe that the Ukrainians are fighting the fight for freedom and honor against the Russian invasion, and that we in the United States and we in NATO need to defend them with as much weaponry as we possibly can get them and billions of dollars in aid until such time as they defeat the Russians and retake Crimea and eastern Ukraine. I want to say something very direct to you. You're being duped by the neocons. If you believe the prevailing narrative that is espoused by people like Yale historian Timothy Snyder and some of the former ambassadors and the Biden administration and the orchestrated throughout the press, that we need to fight to the last Ukrainian to defend democracy and the rule of law in the world. You're being duped, and it's time for you to wake up. I don't know how else to say it. And I want to give a quick historical analogy. Back during Iraq, like today with Ukraine, the Bush administration then, like the Biden administration now, orchestrated a media campaign around Iraq and around how evil Saddam Hussein was and how we had to invade to protect the Iraqis against the tyrant. We saw all kinds of atrocities in the news, and there was hardly any dissenting voice until when they came time for a vote. There was essential unanimity in the Senate and the House, with one or two exceptions, that supported the war. And we marched off into a 20-year colossal disaster based on a lie that the US government repeatedly told, such that 85% of the American people supported the war. And then it began to unravel. We did the same thing in Afghanistan. And 20 years later, after nearly $20 trillion, everybody recognizes those were two colossal disasters. But at that time, the government control over the media and the spin that we were protecting freedom and democracy against the hordes of the Hitler-like figure, Saddam Hussein, or the Taliban, and now Putin, was so overwhelming that the peace movement, particularly initially, was completely overwhelmed, and we marched off to war. I personally was involved in many of the activities protesting at the time, and I met the same kind of antagonism and disbelief as I'm finding today with Ukraine. You talk to almost anybody. Of course, we support the Ukrainians. Of course, we have to defeat the Russians. Of course, Putin is a Hitler-like evil figure. This is about preserving democracy in our way of life. That's what they were saying in Iraq. And I remember it as a young man during the Vietnam War. Even in my own family, my father believed completely that we were in Vietnam to fight the communists. And if we didn't stop communism in Vietnam, it was going to take over all of Southeast Asia. And we were going to be challenged by world communism at the borders of the United States. I burned my draft card. I was organizing against the war. And I was actually disowned by my father. The conflict between he and I was that intense, and thrown out of the house. So I know what it's like to speak out against war. You don't want to be on the wrong side of history. So if you're believing the prevailing narrative about Ukraine, you're on the wrong side of history, just like people were in Vietnam, just like people were in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and Syria and all the other places where the United States has brought war, and now doing it again in Ukraine. It's more complete with Ukraine because the war machine and the neocons have gotten increasingly sophisticated in understanding how to trigger the mass consciousness with code words and script lines that enable people to lose their rationality and support a momentum toward further war. If you look around the world, the United States is at war. It's at war with Russia in Ukraine. It's at war with China over Taiwan. It is fomenting war. It was the United States that triggered the latest conflict in the Sudan. Victoria Nuland was there. The United States governed for the last 30 years by the neocons in this absurd, frenetic desire to somehow preserve American supremacy all over the world as the unipolar nation is wreaking havoc on that world. And that's very important for us to understand. All of us, humanity, but particularly the Europeans and the Americans. The policy formation governing the United States is a policy formation articulated as the Wolfowitz Doctrine back in the early 1990s, right at the moment that the Soviet Union was collapsing. And they felt that this was the moment of the United States to become the hegemon. We are now in a unipolar moment. No longer was it a bipolar world. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and now the United States reigned supreme. And whatever the United States decided it was going to do to maintain its supremacy was okay. And what you've seen for the last 30 years is the United States bringing war and havoc as it competes and as it engages in conflicts to secure markets or diplomatic and political domination. That's what's happening. That's what you need to understand. Ukraine, like Iraq, and like the other wars, is an orchestration by the United States to bring conflict in order to exercise control. You can see this in the history of just what's happened in the Eastern Europe, as I've pointed out repeatedly, but it's worth pointing out one more time. And that is that 30 years ago, the Soviet Union completely controlled all of Eastern Europe because of the Warsaw Treaty Organization. Gorbachev came into power in March of 1985 through December of 1991. And during that time, He proposed the end of the Cold War and said that the Soviets would withdraw from Eastern Europe if the United States would not move an inch, as Secretary of State James Baker put it, to the east with NATO. That was the seminal moment. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed in December of 1991, the United States violated that agreement. And rather than working with the new nations coming out of the Soviet Union, 15 new nations, obviously at the center of which was Russia, the United States decided, under the impulse of this neoconservative US supremacy and world domination doctrine, to do everything it could to keep Russia weak, to keep it on the defensive, and to take over all of Eastern Europe. The Russians have been objecting for 30 years. And finally, in 2008, when George Bush Jr. Demanded that NATO announce that it was going to be taking Ukraine next, Putin said, this is an existential threat. This is a red line. And that's why we have the conflict in Ukraine today. Because Putin finally stood up to the Americans and said, no, you've taken everything else. You're not going to also take Ukraine and our land bridge to Crimea. That's just not going to happen. And what is very, very important for particularly those of you who still believe the Timothy Snyders of the world and the other warmongers that are out there that are talking about victory and how bad the Russians are and how we have to support the Ukrainians. This is a point of view that is limited to the United States and NATO. The rest of the world sees the conflict for what it is, because they, for the most part, have been suffering under the boot of the United States for the last 75 years since the end of the Second World War. The 30 or 40 countries that have had U.S. orchestrated coups, starting with Iran in 1948, the first post-World War II coup orchestrated by the United States and Great Britain, a coup that overthrew an extraordinarily stable and humane regime. And look what's happened to Iran as a consequence. That story can be replicated scores of times around the world. That's the legacy of the United States. And now, at a moment of climate change, when we are experiencing climate turbulence at levels unprecedented in the history of civilization, when we need global cooperation, and the world looks to the United States to lead in some fundamental sense, what are we doing? We're bringing war. We're amplifying the fossil fuel industry. And we're not only bringing war against Russia through Ukraine, which we're using as a proxy, we're bringing war against China. And the rest of the world understands that. That's why there's so much support for the Russians and for Vladimir Putin from the rest of the world. And this is worth everyone taking in. The rest of the world now, I believe, is done with America. As I've said before, Ukraine is the death knell of Pax Americana. It's the death knell of the primacy of the United States over the world. China, Russia, India, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the entire Middle East, most of Africa, Brazil, Latin America, aren't participating with the United States. They are forming their own bloc. 20 years ago, Brazil, Russia, India, China formed the BRIC association, non-US, its own center of gravity. Coming up to the BRIC conference in a couple of months, 20 nations are applying for BRIC membership. South Africa has joined. Iran's joining, Saudi Arabia, all of them are now coming together. And they're not only forming their own non-US, non-NATO, non-EU association and coalition, they're breaking the primacy of the US dollar. When Nixon took the US off the gold standard in 1972, he put the United States dollar on the oil standard. And for 50 years, all oil sold in the world was sold in US dollars. That's over. The Saudis announced last November that no longer will OPEC trade exclusively in the US dollars. ASEAN, that association of Southeast Asia nations, recently announced that they're going to start trading in local currencies. The Russian ruble, the Chinese yuan, all are being traded now globally. So you're seeing the isolation of the United States, the radical dismemberment of dollar supremacy. The dollar, in fact, has been called a toxic currency by many commentators over the last several months. The collapse of the US dollar, the isolation of the US and NATO into a alliance that doesn't control the world, but is operating in antagonism against the rest of the world, which is much bigger by population, which is much bigger by economic capacity, and is only second to the US military, because the United States generally spends more on its military every year than the next 20 or 30 countries in the world combined. And that's what's sucking the US economy dry. That's what's creating many of the disparities. And that's what the rest of the world sees. So you see phenomena, for example, that are unimaginable 5 years ago. Who's the country that is bringing a peace proposal to Ukraine? It's not the United States. It's not the EU. It's China. Who brought Saudi Arabia and Iran together? It wasn't the United States. It was China. Who is building what they call the Great Silk Road all over the world, massive infrastructure around the world? And the Chinese have been saying to the world, we don't need the United States and all its imperialism and military activity all over. We should be trading with one another. We don't need to be fighting one another. So the Chinese now are actively engaging in bringing peace to conflict around the world. And that's part of the new world order that is beginning to emerge right under the feet of the United States as it continues to fight Russia and China. Russia and China, with the rest of the world, are forming a new world order based on currencies other than the US dollar, and a policy formation that is talking more about culture, trade, and neighborliness. That's what the world needs for its next phase of growth and development. So again, if you believe the prevailing narrative, you're making the same mistake as those who believed in the Vietnam War, those who believed in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and all the other places where the United States has destabilized and brought destruction. It's time to wake up. If we don't wake up, we're probably going to blow ourselves up, because I can tell you, Joe Biden is not John Kennedy. There's not a diplomatic bone in his body. He has been part of the neocon war machine for the entire length of his duration in the Senate. He supported Iraq. He supported every war that the United States has fought, without exception. He was instrumental in 2014 as vice president, overthrowing the regime in Ukraine. And he's been at the forefront of the escalating tensions and now the war as we know it in Ukraine, because his avowed goal is to try to weaken Russia, eventually dismember Russia, and then do the same thing to China. So the United States, in these delusions of grandeur as the world's only superpower, can be maintained. And China knows that. That's why they're backing Russia. And that's why they're trying to bring peace to Ukraine. And what's at the heart of the Chinese proposal? At the heart of the Chinese proposal is, listen, this is how it's going to end up. Russia's going to keep what it's taken. Remember, this was not an invasion of Ukraine. This was a limited military action to secure the land bridge to Crimea and secure the Russian population, protect the Russian population in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine needs its sovereignty. It should be sovereign and it should be neutral. The United States has taken over the rest of Eastern Europe. Let Ukraine, which is in some ways the mother of Europe, let it be sovereign and let it be free and let it be neutral within the context of a larger security framework. That's the Chinese proposal. That's essentially what Henry Kissinger said 18 months ago in Davos, is that Russia's going to keep what it's taken, and we need to honor the integrity of Ukraine within a larger security framework, which goes back to the Gorbachev proposal. There's absolutely no reason for the United States and NATO and the EU to be so hostile against Russia, particularly since Russia, for the last 30 years, has wanted peace, has wanted to actually join NATO, join the EU. That's what the Gorbachev line and the Yeltsin and Putin line were for a very long time. And it was only in the response to a relentless expansion of US presence into Eastern Europe that finally the Russians hardened their position and have now taken what they will never surrender, because those lands have now been annexed into Russia. So it's the Chinese proposal is a very sound starting place for diplomacy. But what we all need to do is wake up that this war is going to take us into nuclear oblivion if we don't stop it. And that's why I keep doing these teach-ins, and we have these summits on Ukraine, on Humanity Rising, is because we need urgently to have a ceasefire, to have diplomacy, to honor the map on the ground. If we do that, we can rebuild Ukraine in a massive way as a peace center for Europe, not a zone of war. So we need to wake up, all of us, and see reality as it is, because we will end up in an unimaginable disaster if the current momentum for this war continues. So those are my thoughts for today. Take them seriously, because the world situation is deteriorating as we speak. Peace can be crafted if we just bring about a ceasefire and recognize that history no longer needs the United States as the hegemon. We need to embrace a multipolar world where everyone is honored for who they are and who they represent. That's the kind of future we want to leave to our children, not the wasteland of nuclear fires. Thank you, everyone.